So the plan is before you start. I tell the plan. What is it?
All right, so our last guest, Riccardo Villa. He's a PhD researcher at TU Vienna, and he's almost done with his PhD, and hopefully, well, very. Say that we're gonna keep working. But I'm really happy that you're here, really, and I look forward to your talk. I look forward to asking you a lot of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I'm also very happy to be here. Actually, I was a bit like caught off guard when Carla called me for this conference. First of all, because I kind of. I mean, these topics like AI, augmented reality, VR are something that I was somehow familiar with, especially because of the collaboration with our sister chair in Zurich, but also Carla from our conference. But I never really addressed this topic directly in my work. But nevertheless, I wanted still I still accepted to come here for at least like some reasons. First of all, the first one I would say is because I haven't been in Orlando since I was 8 years old, so it was a good way to come back. But also I was very eager to see what you all had to present, and I was very happy to be here and also to learn from things that are quite, let's say, in a way, could be far from my interest, but actually then it's always very interesting for me to make bridges towards them, because then the core, I think, on the abstract level, they can be quite close, actually. And then also kind of to have some kind of challenge, which was, let's try and speak about orthodox icons in a conference about AI. Let's see if we can do it. So first of all, I would like to start of somehow how I kind of got the reception of the brief of the conference. So the idea of playing models for me, what evokes is this idea of models in relationship to instruments and not as much as to tools. So of course, the idea of instruments as something like that can be played, and therefore somehow a questioning of what I would say, what I would call a pragmatic or programmatic paradigm, so one that goes with efficiency optimization systems, as it was written in the description of it. And in this regard, for me, a helpful distinction is the one that was already proposed by Ludger in some time ago, which was one. Here he was referring to programming languages, but I think we can extend it, is like call it a paradigm. So the one between deliberative and imperative paradigm. So the deliberative one for me connects with, of course, the idea of freedom. So that's what it's somehow implied in the idea of deliberative. But it's also freedom as a liberation from, but also is somehow also a kind of political idea. So the liberation is a communal or a political resolution, a political decision. And imperative, of course, is linked to a more kind of commanding paradigm. And what I understand today is that there is somehow a dominance, especially in a kind of epistemological way, of the imperative, that makes the deliberative paradigm somehow today lost or hidden or invisible. In this sense, I would say to borrow from the presentation of Nicola and of Jorge, I would say that today Narcissus hides the form of Aphrodite in his mirror. And this is somehow I can find resonance with my work. So for me, the invisible character, so the deliberative one, is the one embodied in what I would call the image. In my doctoral thesis that if everything goes well, I will defend on the 18th of July. There is a quest for the image as something which is today lost, invisible, transparent, precisely like this deliberative character that underlies an understanding of models in terms of instrumentality and not of utility. But then why the image? Because of course the images can be, how can an image be something lost, hidden, or invisible, since the image is actually the visible par excellence in some way. This somehow I would like to introduce to you through this quote of Hans Blumenberg from his lecture he did in 1961, which is called Weltbilder und Weltmodelle, so world models and world pictures, where he presents this distinction between world model and world image, and it's by saying that in modernity, where we pass is like we pass from world images to world models. So the world model is kind of replacing what once was the world image, and whereas the world model is related to something about it's about accounts and statements. So it's, let's say, more linked to an imperative part in the description I was proposing before. Word image is more about orientation. So what I liked about word image, so I was thinking about how we could recover the image also, is the idea of image as something which is linked to orientation, but also is linked most of all to, so because Blumenberg speaks of world models in relation to the fact that in a world model, man is a reference, whereas in a world picture, man is the center. So by placing man in the center, what is interesting for me is that the center means that there can always be a beyond the center. So man is of course at the center, but there can always, in the image, there is this possibility of a beyond. And coming back so to the notion of image, what I would argue that today the notion of image is that either reduced to the one of pictures or the representation of something pre-existing, so a model or a reality. So reduced again to an imperative paradigm in which the image shows more or less precisely what the model dictates, and is judged according to such a standard, or either to the notion of imaginary or imagination. So on one hand, an objective paradigm versus a subjective understanding. And in my understanding, so in my thesis, let's say, both fail to grasp this, again, this deliberative character, because one is imperative, so the objective one, and the other is a matter of interiority. So it's not communal nor political, it's just a kind of psychic fact. And what I would argue is that there is a third kind of image that does not coincide with any of those poles. So here today, I would like to briefly demonstrate this with two models. The first one, which some of you already heard me speak about, comes from French landscape architect and theoretician Gilles Clément. So in his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, Clément begins with the introduction of three concepts. So it's called them three words that requires precise definition. The first concept is the one of landscape. And landscape, he says, is what lies under the expanse of our gaze. For the blind, it might be what is within the reach of all the other senses. Landscape appears to be essentially subjective because it is a transcription of a feeling, as for example in a painting. It is apprehended through a powerful filter composed of personal experience and cultural armature. These facts made landscape impossible to define universally. Thus, theoretically, for one given site, there are as many landscapes as there are individuals to interpret it. So in that sense, landscape is something eminently, we could say, sensible. So it lies under the expanse of our gaze. And as such, landscape is subjective. So as Clément remarks, landscape cannot be universally defined. For one given site, there are as many landscapes as there are individuals to interpret it, he says. So as something that is both sensible and subjective, landscape well illustrates the image that pertains to what I was calling as the imaginary. So a kind of private and subjective kind of image. A third quality of landscape has somehow to do with is the one of scripture writing, I would say, or better transcription. So because it can be transcribed in painting. This we'll see later how it plays in the constellation. The second notion introduced by him is the one of environment. Environment, he writes, is the exact opposite of landscape in as much as it attempts to give an objective interpretation of our surroundings. It is also the shareable side of landscape. A scientific interpretation provided by tools that anyone, regardless of culture, can understand and consider in the same way. The acidity or alkalinity of the soil, the pH, is measured in the same way in Europe, Asia, or Africa, with the same tools and communicated in the same words. The sound of a site, the radioactive emission of a rock, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the pollution rate of a river, etc., are all quantified in the same precise ways all over the planet, leading to a kind of technical Esperanto that allows a scientific reading of our environment. So if landscape on one hand is subjective, environment is the objective pole. So is an objective interpretation of our surroundings. And furthermore, environment, as Clement describes it, is not something sensible. So the image of the environment is not produced by the senses, but by instruments of analysis. So environment, therefore, is something that can be, I would say, read or calculated. It has something to do with language and accounting. So it's something produced to what Clement calls a scientific reading. So if landscape is sensible, I would say environment is with the intelligible. Environment is closer to the other kind of image, the objective one that stands as a representation of a reality of a model. And as a reading, environment is a matter of translation. So on one hand, you have transcription, and here we have translation. So it always requires a convention, a language, what Clement calls a technical Esperanto. Instead, landscape can be transcribed even without having any particular language of convention. So on the one hand, we have landscape, which is subjective, sensible, and can be transcribed, and environment, which is objective, intelligible, and can be translated. The third concept that Clement introduced is the one of the garden. So we're back with the garden. Yeah.
Okay, wow. Mixture.
The garden escapes cultural divides, right. The garden refers only to environment to set up an adequate rules of gardening, and it refers only to landscape insofar as it constantly creates new ones. So the garden somehow transcends this dichotomy of environment and landscape. So it is neither one nor the other, and it is therefore, I would say, autonomous from them. But autonomous in this sense doesn't mean that it is autarkic. So it entertains in its autonomy a relationship with both. It sets rules within the environment and it engenders landscape. And by doing so, it affects both. So in its landscape is not just anymore subjective, but it becomes an object as it is engendered or created by the garden. At the same time, through the establishment of rules, the garden relativizes the objectivity of the environment and it accommodates within it rooms of subjectivity. So we have on one hand, we have with the garden, we have the landscape that becomes an object and an environment where that becomes also a room for subjectivity. And so we can perhaps say that the garden is a domain for both subjective objectivity and an objective subjectivity. So there is a kind of this double articulation of which also Carla was speaking of at the beginning of yesterday. So in that sense, this garden is kind of a quantum because it's also dealing with both transcription and translation. And for me, transcription and translation are related to resolution, which is for me related to a quickness, and then position. So the translation is also about, let's say, what is the position of the language? Let's say, are you inside or outside the language? So this double articulation is a kind of inversion of things that the garden operates and is quite consistent with constitutes the garden in itself, so the plants. And in this book, so here I'm quoting the book of Life of Plants from Emanuele Coccia, that writes that plants challenge one of the pillars of the biological and natural sciences of the past few centuries. The priority of the environment over the living, of the world over life, of space over the subject. Plants, he writes, demonstrate that living beings produce the space in which they live rather than being forced to adapt to it. So somehow it's not a matter of adapting to a reality, but of casting it. They demonstrate that life is a rupture in the asymmetry between container and contained. When there is life, the container is located in the contained and is thus contained by it, and vice versa. So this inversion is similar to the one operated by the garden, in which the environment or the objective becomes the subject, becomes subject to rules. A landscape or the subjective becomes engendered as an object. Both plants and garden in this sense suspend that imperative paradigm according to which it is the environment or the reality to dictate the rules according to which the subject has to adapt, and allows for a communication between, so the garden allows for a communication between the two worlds that does not need to follow this paradigm. So the one is subject of the object. And on this line of thought, here we come to the icon of the connection. So on this line of thought of the connection between these two worlds, so the objective, the subjective, the one of the, if you want, the reality and the imaginary, which is private and public. I would like to introduce the second model that I would like to discuss. So the one of the icon, and specifically as discussed by Russian theologian Pavel Florensky in a book called Iconostasis. So Florensky in this book describes the religious icon as a border, of course, between the visible and invisible and between the mundane and the divine. But such a border, the important thing, is not something traced once and for all and removable, but it is one endowed with a certain kind of, I would say, mechanics, or it is a kind of architectonic border. Florensky explains the mechanics of the icon in analogies with the one of a peculiar kind of dreams. So the ones that he says are induced by some external cause. So the ones dreams are in which, for instance, a noise or some other external stimulus forces the dream and the sleep to conclusion. For example, he writes, I dream that a pistol shot goes off, and in the room near me, someone is really shot, or somebody has slammed the door. Or I dream that someone falls upon me and begins to strangle me, and I awake in terror to find that a pillow has fallen on my chest. Or I dream that I am attacked by a dog, and I awake to find that a mosquito has bitten me. So in this setup, Florensky identifies this external stimulus. So for instance, the slammed door or the mosquito bite. So the one that belonging to a daytime consciousness with omega, and the event inside of the dream with X. The event X inside the dream is therefore an image of the stimulus omega outside of it. Such an image merges, according to Florensky, two different temporalities. So both of them seem to move apparently from one event to the other, so from cause to effect. And even in the dream X, which is the final event, seems the effect and the conclusion of a series of events. So it seems a conclusion of events. So A was the original event, led to R, to S, to T, to X, which is the concluding event of the dream. The fact is that as an image of omega, X is instead the point from which all the other events spring. So an effect from which all its own causes are engendered. So it's actually the opposite. So we have therefore two kinds of temporalities: the real time of daylight consciousness, that's so to say, and what Florensky calls an inverted time, or a time that flows backward. Because all the events that precede the event X, and that seems in the dream to be the cause of it, are instead retroactively justified by it, since in the light of the awake consciousness, it is the final event that caused the entire dream to unfold. Did you kind of get how the scheme works? Okay. The temporality of the dream is nonetheless not just going backwards. So it's not just about mirroring, but it's also instantaneous. So in the dream, Florensky notes the time runs at an accelerated speed, because the whole cascade of events that happened in the dream time cannot be drawn but instantaneously. So at the infinite speed of the instant of the external stimulus omega that causes and at the same time put an end to the dream, which became like it happened at the same time of the stimulus. So he says time in the dream runs and accelerated it runs towards the actual and against the movement of time in waking consciousness. Dream time is turned inside out, which means all its concrete images are also turned inside out with it. And that means we have entered the domain of imaginary space. Of course, this imaginary is not just anymore a kind of private imaginary, but it's something which is is extend beyond the privacy of the subject. And we found here once again, that this is not that the imaginary is not like just private, but it has its own physics, and most importantly, it communicates through the image, which is in this case the icon, with the real. And not only real and imaginary communicate with each other, but they are convertible with each other. So it says that the very same event is perceived from the area of actual space as the actual is seen very same event that is perceived from the area of actual space as actual is seen from the area of imaginary space as imaginary. So to understand such convertibility, we could perhaps, and this I'm not sure, but I just placed with you this analogy. So we could think of the imaginary, inverted instantaneous time of nighttime and consciousness as light, as light, and of the real time of daylight consciousness as matter. So once we start, or as gravity. So once we start to move at the speed of light, light turns into matter, and matter turns into light. And this convertibility and communication is what the icon or the iconostasis ensures. So the icon as an image is what makes this convertibility, or with this passage, this communication possible. So contrarily, writes, the goal seen from here appears as something cherished by lacking the inner energy of the ideal. But since from there, through the other consciousness, the goal is comprehended as living energy that shapes actuality and its creative form. So death becomes life, and life becomes death somehow. Seen through the paradigm of iconostasis, imaginary space is in this sense what I would call a projectual space in an architectonic sense. So as indeed the goals and not the causes are what shaped actuality. So precisely like in an architectural project, the representation, let's say, precedes actuality and not vice versa. And the icon is precisely this boundary and the connection that turns this living energy into an actual environment, precisely like the life of plants described by Kocha. So something able to shape its own environment and to question its character of necessity. So it's imperative again paradigm. So something that is able to do so by rupturing the asymmetry of things, subject and object in the case of the garden, container containing the one of plants, and we would say mundane and divine in the case of the icon. So here I move towards the conclusion. We have garden and icon. So what does this have to do with architecture, and how can we understand them as model to rethink images within the digital, as I kind of claim in my title? So first of all, garden and icon are models of an image that is neither following an imperative paradigm, so it is not dictated, nor is completely arbitrary. This is not merely scientific, nor merely artistic, we could say. And yet, in its connection, is in connection with both. So in that sense, it's architectonic. But it is architectonic precisely because by transcending both these poles, it articulates them. So this third image is therefore truly deliberative, I would say. And as Aristotle once wrote that the deliberative intelligence is architectonic intelligence. This deliberative quality is achieved through a compenetration between different domains that are apparently incompatible. So subject and object, public and private, sensitive and intelligent, mundane and divine, natural and artificial, and we can keep on going. And perhaps this, I don't know, will be my kind of proposal / question here. It will be interesting to think about terms such as virtual reality, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, game engine, etc. So the terms that are somehow the keywords of this concern, precisely as gardens or as icons. So, for instance, as images in which the domain of the objective, so artificial objects, machines, reality engines, is endowed with a certain subjectivity, so intelligence, learning, virtual playfulness. So something that goes beyond a mere logic comprehension, so to say. And in particular regard to the digital and the icon, or to the iconostasis, it would be perhaps interesting to think of the digital image as a compenetration, so a confluence and an articulation of two temporalities, so between a time of necessity and of gravity and a fertile time full of grace, so to say, and also to kind of quote the icon here. So think of the digital as what Roberto Calasso calls the confluence between digital and digitable. So images are not just digital, but digitable. So they contract two different temporalities, a closed one and an open one. And the confluence of the digital, of the digitable, it can also be analogous to the coincidence of what we have in the garden, which is a coincidence of design and construction. So which is somehow, I think, could also be something which was linked to Daniela's talk. So here I'm quoting Vittorio Aureli and Maria Giurici, that in their concise history of gardens write that the making of a garden blurs the traditional distinction between design and construction. So design and construction compenetrate in the garden like divine and mundane in the icon, and digital in the image. So, and this, let's say, to conclude, as I would propose to read the title of the conference, or Play Models. Not that, and the playfulness here is not something alternative to something serious or responsible. So, like could be fiction or virtuality that is not reality, but the playfulness of models here, or rather, in my case of the image, as something immanent to the seriousness of things, as a something, so as a deliberative dimension, and as such, not only as something that calls, and as such, not only calls for ethical and political responsibility, but as something that makes room for them. Thank you. Drinks over dinner, question over dinner.
I love how you put the idea of an icon. If you think of an icon as this kind of gate, almost, or a way how this divine and mundane can communicate, how would you argue why these guys, or in different times in history, were fighting for closing this gate or for removing this gate, this iconoclasm? What is iconoclasm then about?
Yeah,
how to think about it?
I think that's how the way, because I mean, I think it has to do with I mean, this, I'm not an expert in the history of, but I think it's what then it's about the mechanics of these icons, so how does the icon work, and yeah, it's really, I would say, at the bottom a theological political question, no? So it has to do with the way power can have a face, and then how can be also administered. So who is in charge of administering it? So of course, I mean, if you deny the icon, or if you say it's a fake image, you kind of tend to favor, I would say, the imperative party, no? So in which power is not just divided between, let's say, spiritual and temporal, but is where the temporal can absorb the spiritual power. So this would be, let's say, a more I don't know if you call it a Protestant kind of understanding of the icon. And but then, yeah, there are many nuances which I still didn't think about it, but yeah, it'd be interesting, for instance, to think of what's the difference between a Catholic and Orthodox icon, and I think this has to do with the role that is. So how can you what's your power of negotiation with this invisible? No, so can you actually have the same say, or can you play with it, or is it still dominating you? So this is all different constellation and configurations, which are, in my understanding, equally interesting, but they cast different different system of powers.
Just short, and with this with the garden and the icon, you think of them as kind of complementary or in relation to each other? What's just this?
These are different kind of models for me to think how. So I'm thinking the image. And also in my dissertation, I have the image of the temple, the garden, the icon. I have the name. I have different ways through which. So it's a bit how to think of the image as an invariance. No, so I have these different variations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is the invariance. Huh? Yeah. The garden is the invariance. The icon is the invariance. This is super nice, because then you have the day and the night, and then you have that which kind of decides which one to engage with, because you cannot be in the day and the night same time. No.
Yeah.
So then it's this thing in the garden the same. The sensible and the rational. So it kind of feels like this void, this invariance, which is the garden, which is the icon. And then it would be why it would shut, these doors were shut. The idea that you don't have to make any decision. So this will be a way to kill this invariance, to say, if you shut this, then there's no decision making in such a model. Then someone is making a decision for
exactly.
you.
Yeah.
And this is why in these models, with this story, this is why this was shut. Yeah. Because it's not there's no persona, so there's life because there's life and there's day in life, so there's life lived, but there's no decision as to one or the other one.
Yeah.
This decision when you have the icon or when you don't have.
When you shut the icon, then you don't have. When someone says you don't deal with the icons, so then it's you live, but you cannot make any decision. I mean, in this sense, I would. I don't know. These two models are like super. Are like super interesting. But no, I guess I just wanted to share and ask you if these models were working like this. But basically, it's what you said. This is the invariant. This is the void. This is the axis of rotation. This is the axis of orientation. You even mentioned it.
Yeah, it's about, so the way I always try to understand it also is, yes, it was always this kind of games of oppositions, but in which opposition are never fixed, so they can always, so they're always kind of sorry, to be thrown away, you know? So it's what's so for instance, I always think of orientation in opposition to direction, you know? So in direction you have kind of someone tells you what to do, and orientation you have a kind of fixed cardinal point, but then you can turn around and yeah, so in that sense, it's always to think of the invariance as something, so the image as an invariance, but as something, so that you always have to have something which is a something without which you cannot think of the invariance in itself. So it's a non without in that sense. So in that sense, it's a kind of invisible image, or is a lost image, as Blumenberg would say.
No, that's fine. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it was great. I'm now thinking about these icons. I'm thinking about also what Miro says, like, why were they removed? And we are talking about sound. So now I'm introducing some level of locality, because Orthodox icons is what I grew up with, yeah. And you know how they were punished, how this was punished. For example, this was destroyed by the basically Ottomans, who are in principle not allowed to do that, to have them, yeah, as a way of going between intelligible and sensible. This is not what they can have in between. Something else needs to be there. So they were blinding them. They were not destroying them. They were just blinding them. And so this idea of seeing was removed from them. And I'm very curious, why that? Were they trying to kill the sensible or intelligible? Because it's a very specific gesture. Do you have any fantasy about?
No, I mean, the question about, so I'm not, if you ask me kind of question about the history of icons, I didn't ask you that, you catch me unprepared, unfortunately. But I would say that if one blinds the icon, it's not trying to kill the sensible or the intelligible, but the door between them, between one and the other. So it's always about the door and the window. So Florensky talks about window. So he says it's a wall, but it's a window at the same time. So yeah, and it's there that I understand the architectonic dimension, because if you go one or the other, then you kind of make a choice.
Fantastic. This is awesome. I want to think about this. Please, if you can send me your book, or I'm going to buy it. But this is really great. I was thinking, there was recently a podcast by Federico Campagna where he talks about Florensky and his counter perspective idea, which I think is really interesting. How does that play into your thinking?
I haven't read the counter perspective book yet. I mean, I kind of started reading, but I think, I mean, if I can speculate on what this would be about, is precisely to question perspective and Western perspective as this kind of imperative paradigm, so where you have becomes a kind of the debate, like what would be then developed as a kind of rendering. So rendering literally means a restitution, which is then an image that works only in a closed economical terms. So it has a balance which is already made. So where somehow the symbolic or the political in itself has no role anymore. So you're kind of it's a bit what Luca was saying with this CO2, this kind of thing. So you have a kind of blind vision in that sense.
So perspective is kind of in that, it belongs to that regime, right?
Yeah, I would say he would argue that in order to recover precisely the inverse perspective, which I would say then it's precisely what like the inverse time. No? So it speaks of inverse time.
Right.
Then inverse perspective would be the same thing. Yeah.
That's really interesting. But especially like the entire history of computer graphics is perspective. You know?
Yeah.
Thank you. I always enjoy listening to your presentations. So this is going to be a question that probably, okay, I will try to articulate it. It's late. But we have this dichotomy or this double articulation. So you start with landscape and environment. So what I understood is that there is this double articulation between these two, and then you propose the garden as the door, as the wall with the window, or like as the bridge that allows kind of the communication.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just thinking in how I see this double articulation, and in the way I understand them is that they are these two law instruments, or we were talking at the beginning. And then in the way I think of artificial intelligence, and then all of these other storytelling techniques that we've been talking in this conference, are you suggesting that the garden is the rendering of the thing that is happening between landscape and environment?
I wouldn't call it a rendering because the garden, in my understanding, is pre-specific to this division, and it's what articulates this division. So in the garden, it happens the double articulation. So the double articulation happens in the garden. So it's what is projected, but not. Yeah, it's hard to. This is a problem with specifically with English, that it doesn't have a term for, because you would say design, but it's not what is design. Let's say in the or architected. It's an ugly word.
What will be in Italian? I just want to know.
Progettata, so projected, but then in English becomes something which is more again under the imperative part. But, I'm trying to remember what you asked me about. The garden is a rendering of this double. Yeah. So this is the garden and the image. So the image in my in my thesis is precisely what is pre-specific in that sense, or so there's a primacy of the image and the primacy of the garden over this distinction. So you never say reality in fiction, but you say there is something which comes before, which is also, so that's why I chose the image, because the image is always kind of mistrusted, not because it's fake, but because it brings together fakeness and truth. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a hybrid, and you can't really extricate one and the other. Therefore, that's why it becomes not just a political problem, but a theological political problem. So it's on all the verses, and in that sense, I like to think of architecture in relation also to information, sorry, as something which has to do with an agnostic kind of theology, no? So not a theology that has a religion as a peculiar religion as a base, but as something which is an agnostic. So it's kind of makes room for things.
I don't know if we actually want to answer this question right now or even talk about it, but not your question, you know. But this, I really like the clarity of the diagram of this sort of daytime, nighttime, inversion, the two-way quality of these things, right? The ability to peer into multiple conditions in the garden and the ability to do the same thing in the icon, and that they both see, right? And so, or at least they both affect you and you affect them, right? This why would you blind an icon, right? Is it takes away its two-way quality, right? And so, but this suggests that the image exists in a kind of world of inverted time and circular time and time that, you know, the the consequence happened before the, the cause and all these sorts of things. But well, she just walked out, but this is completely at odds with the idea of like a chronotopic, that all architecture is fixed to or dependent on its moment in time, right? Which I think, this is not saying, is that the difference between images and right? Like there's questions about what is architecture. Like many people, Boulez is this sort of, the drawing is the architecture, right? And the image of the architecture is the architecture, but that this is maybe a difference between the two.
Sorry, what would be the
That one works two ways in time, and one can only work one way in time. That architecture can only be in this moment of time. It's chronotopic, at least if we accept the argument from the last lecture, right? And that the image can work both ways.
I would say architecture has to do with the image as I describe it. Not sure about this chronotopic kind of definition. I think this is I don't know, because I have the feeling it has to do more with the notion of event that is therefore of the actual time. So it's not considering what Florensky would call the imaginary space. So it's not considering photons. It's not considering, and it's trying to recreate the kind of qualities that are there through instruments that belong to the actual time. That's how I could understand this, but I'm not super sure about it.
I think it gets into kind of maybe the disappointment, that Luca expressed over the moment of like baking the acoustic wall, right, that you were talking about yesterday, right? It's just like, why would you ever make one? Because then you only have the one, and it's so much better to have all of them all at once, and these kinds of questions of, I guess just an ancient question of the joy and the pain of like actually building the thing,
But yeah, just let's say to abstract a bit from the things what might be is that, especially with robots, there's and with robotic fabrication, I have the feeling there is a kind of fascination with the idea of alienating the subjects in order to sacralize it, because then it's always, so as she was saying, then they dance with the robots, so it's about then giving back this kind of, so making the subject sacred again, and so having this kind of almost a theological question, but then that reverts onto, so as I was saying, so my interest in the image is that man is at the center of the word image, but that means that there's something beyond man. So then this would bring back again man as a reference, not as a center. So it's hyper anthropocentric.
Right.
Yeah.
You missed the discussion about
So there was just one thing. There was a meme going around. Have you seen it? And it was posted about how it was working.
Yeah.
What do you think about this? Actually, no. What do you think about the black hole?
I was promised a difference in the definition of an image in a picture.
So I would say that the image is the difference, but I don't know. I will think about the black hole, because that's what.
It was like a big deal in suddenly there's like a community black hole, so you cannot possibly make an image of, right? Like, so.
But the thing is that the image I'm after is not.
I understand that.
It's not an image that you would make of something. Because, yeah.
It's not a free cultural
So
it's a sort of free understanding.
agreed.
It's just the same way that have understanding what black holes supposed to look like.
But I think that these sort of ideas of icons and things that are accumulated through a culture are sort of a collective understanding of what these things look like.
Yeah, I mean, what I would retain of the black hole image is the without kind of thing. So you need kind of that picture in order to somehow start understanding, but you have to lose the picture. So it's
I think the image of the black hole is exactly a world image. I mean, I'm joking. Just I think because it cannot be objective. Yeah. So the black hole is a fantastic image. So it's really coming from an imaginary space, and it's not an image that you can see.
oh, yeah,
So
I understand.
the black thing with the orange is a rendering of an
Yeah.
image of the world, which is actually a kind of an interesting world image because it talks about how we think about the world, how we think about the beginning of the world, and it's totally fantastic. Yeah?
Any image is the
Yeah, any image of God is the same thing. Any image of the world,
No, but it's
representation how you see it.
no, but it's exactly on the thin line, yeah, that it has to use all the technology, it has to use all the data, it wants to be extremely objective, and yet it's extremely fantastic at the same time. So it's exactly in the garden. This image is a flower that grows in the garden, in my understanding. Yeah?
No, there's a flower.
It's exactly the space, the most interesting space.
This argument now that this black hole is a garden, this black hole
Is a flower.
the icon. No, it's the icon.
Icon, yeah.
Both pictures are on the same level. Because the first one is not objective at all. It is absolutely beyond what's on the pixels.
Yeah, but it even doesn't work. The first one is pure propaganda. Yeah?
Exactly.
The National Geographic.
And the second
Yeah.
one. But the
The second one is a different kind of propaganda. Yeah, but it's coming from a different space.
The thing is
Huh?
like the second one.
But then everything is, tell me what is not propaganda in this sense.
Every image is propaganda.
And the first one as well.
So in this sense, everything is propaganda. Okay, then which one is not?
What's the purpose of an
It's
image?
about educating
Something which has no visual.
Isn't it? Isn't it that the black hole is?
Guys, don't get too much iconoclastic.
See what you did, see what you did.
I love drama.
Then my question is, which image is not propaganda?
The image that wants to teach you anything.
Which is, can you give an example?
Let's ask Adil.
Adil, which image is not
Closing
propaganda?
remarks.
Come on.
Just give me one example.
There is no image that is not propaganda.
What?
The propaganda
And,
is
Why? Because so they cannot be that judging.
Yeah, I agree with Roger.
This image is not propaganda. It's not trying to inform me certain. It's not. This image is generous.
You mean the poster?
Yeah. And this image.
Poster.
This image is generous.
Get people
This
here.
is trying to talk about something.
Maybe there's a different term than propaganda.
Yeah, I didn't say propaganda.
No, but I said propaganda just for one. You said that both are propaganda.
Yes, they are not propaganda because one is teaching you the current state of the world, which is this Afghan girl that is really in trouble and she's beautiful. Look at her eyes, it's so beautiful. Look how fucked up the world is. Politica, geopolitics, and the other one is look how science is able to solve.
I mean, this I agree, but I don't see them in this way. I agree with your statement, but I see them radically different. Yeah? I see the first one, I see how you are
I
saying.
agree with all the same.
Which
They are
one?
both the same. From the meat.
Yeah, actually.
So first of all, it's actually Nicholas.
First one is not a camera, it's a DSLR, yeah? So it's a simulation of a camera. Yeah? And the second one is a simulation of a different kind of camera.
Oh.
Yeah, but the second one is talking
Of a different frequency.
you believe it's
None
on
of
the
them
huge effort.
are.
What do you mean?
But the woman exists, but the picture
And
is.
black hole exists as well.
You know.
One camera is tuned to very much like a simulation in this proper scientific sense, which is tuned to our world. And second one, they do not know how to tune because you cannot tune it to anything. Therefore, it's more interesting.
Exactly.
But it's similar.
But it's simulating. Pushes you to another space.
I think it has to
The
do with
first one is pushing
storytelling.
you to one space, and the other one is pushing you to think what the other space might be about.
It's not the image, it's the object that you're actually looking at.
Yeah, of course.
So it's not, it's like images are.
Riccardo. Guys.
This was amazing, thank you. I think we don't need to discuss anymore.
I think we're gonna see that, no?
I heard that triggers that I have to wake up early tomorrow.
For some more propaganda.
Adil. Goodbye, Adil.
Thank you.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Thank you for organizing, Adil.
Have a good night.